In her Seattle dining room, 80-year-old Deborah Taylor discovered her children's true priorities when they presented nursing home brochures as birthday gifts. The retired real estate attorney wasn't your typical retiree. For 30 years, she'd built her fortune through sharp legal strategy. When her adult children revealed their coordinated plan to warehouse her in assisted living, viewing her primarily as an inheritance obstacle, Debbie's response would shock them. She methodically researched tenant law and drafted eviction notices, launching a calculated legal campaign. What began as hurt feelings became a family war exposing decades of manipulation and exploitation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The balloons hung at cheerful angles from the dining room chandelier, their bright colors, a stark contrast to the tension that seemed to permeate every corner of Debbie Taylor's sprawling Seattle home. At 80, she moved with the deliberate precision of someone who had learned to compensate for age without surrendering to it. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her makeup applied with the same attention to detail she'd once brought to closing million-dollar real estate deals. "Happy birthday, Mom!" Linda's voice carried that particular pitch of forced enthusiasm that had become her default setting over the past 3 years of living under her mother's roof. She gestured dramatically toward a cluster of her latest sculptures arranged on the mahogany sideboard, abstract pieces that looked more like accidents than art. "I thought my work would add some life to the celebration." Debbie surveyed the misshapen clay forms with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to find diplomatic responses to disappointing situations. "They're very expressive, dear." James Morrison, Linda's husband, shifted uncomfortably in his chair at the dining table. His once confident posture had gradually collapsed over 2 years of unemployment. 2 years of living in his mother-in-law's house like a displaced teenager. He caught Debbie's eye and offered a small, apologetic smile that she had learned to read as code for, "I'm sorry my wife is being insufferable again." 16-year-old Marcus looked up from his phone, his intelligent eyes taking in the scene with the sharp awareness that seemed to be his burden. "Grandma, do you want me to help you with anything in the kitchen?" It was a small kindness, but Debbie felt it like a warm hand on her shoulder. At least someone in this house saw her as more than furniture or a meal ticket. "Thank you, sweetheart. I think we're managing fine." The front door burst open with the dramatic flair that announced David's arrival before his voice did. At 45, he still carried himself like the golden boy he'd been in high school, though the gold had tarnished considerably. His teenage daughters, Emma and Sophie, trailed behind him with the resigned expressions of children who had learned to navigate their father's emotional weather patterns. "Sorry I'm late, Mom," David announced, his charm turned up to maximum voltage. "You would not believe the day I've had. The investors for the food truck concept backed out at the last minute, completely blindsided me. But that's business, right? You taught me that." He leaned down to kiss her cheek, and she caught the faint scent of beer on his breath. "Happy birthday to the most amazing woman I know." Debbie accepted the kiss, but noted the practiced nature of his affection. Everything about David felt rehearsed these days, as if he were constantly auditioned for the role of good son, while his real attention remained focused on some invisible scoreboard where he calculated what he was owed. "Girls," David continued, addressing his daughters with the casual authority of someone who saw them every other weekend and special occasions, "go ahead and give Grandma your cards." Emma, the elder at 15, stepped forward with a homemade card that showed actual effort and care. "We made these ourselves, Grandma. I know it's not much, but it's perfect, darling." Debbie's voice carried genuine warmth as she opened the card to find a heartfelt message written in Emma's careful handwriting. These girls, at least, hadn't been completely corrupted by their father's example. The garage door rumbled open, announcing Tommy's emergence from his converted living space. At 38, he moved with the careful deliberation of someone managing more than just the effects of age. His eyes were slightly glassy, but he'd clearly made an effort to clean up for the occasion. His smile, when it appeared, still carried traces of the boy who had once been her baby. "Happy birthday, beautiful," he said, wrapping her in a hug that lasted just a moment too long, as if he were trying to absorb some of her strength through proximity. "Sorry I'm running a bit slow today. Had a late night working on my thesis proposal." The lie came so smoothly that Debbie almost believed he believed it himself. Tommy had been working on various thesis proposals for the better part of a decade, collecting degrees and graduate credits like some people collected stamps. The real late night had likely involved whatever prescription medication he'd managed to obtain, but she had long ago learned that challenging his stories only led to elaborate explanations that exhausted them both. "Well," Linda announced with the air of someone calling a meeting to order, "I think it's time for presents. Mom, we all put a lot of thought into this year's gifts." Debbie settled into her favorite armchair, the one piece of furniture in the house that still felt entirely hers, as her children arranged themselves around the coffee table with the eager anticipation of people who believed they were about to solve a problem. David spoke first, his salesman's smile in full effect. "Mom, we've been talking, and we've realized something important. You've been carrying the burden of this big house all by yourself, and that's not fair to you." "We worry about you," Linda added, her voice taking on the syrupy tone she used when she wanted something. "You're 80 now, and this place is so much work. The stairs, the maintenance, the isolation." Tommy nodded along, though his agreement seemed more mechanical than heartfelt. "The thing is, Ma, we love you too much to watch you struggle." Debbie felt the first cold touch of unease, like a draft from a door she hadn't realized was open. "I'm managing fine, children. I've lived in this house for 35 years. That's exactly the point," David continued, reaching for a stack of wrapped packages that were too flat to be anything but brochures or pamphlets. "We've done research. We've found some really wonderful options." The paper crinkled as she unwrapped the first package, revealing a glossy brochure for Sunset Manor, where golden years shine brightest. The cover featured smiling elderly people, engaged in what looked like aggressively cheerful activities. The second package yielded Peaceful Pines Assisted Living, your home away from home. The third was Serenity Gardens, comprehensive care for your loved one. Debbie stared at the brochures in her lap, their cheerful covers suddenly seeming obscene. The room had gone quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, her grandfather's clock in her house, surrounded by her children, who were suggesting she leave it all behind. "These places have wonderful programs," Linda rushed to fill the silence. "Art therapy, social activities, professional medical care on site. You'd have friends your own age, people to talk to who understand what you're going through." "What I'm going through?" Debbie's voice was quiet, but there was something in its tone that made Marcus look up from his phone. David leaned forward, his expression earnest in the way that had convinced 3 different wives to marry him before they figured out what lay beneath the surface. "Mom, you have to admit, rattling around in this big place all by yourself can't be healthy. And think about the value you're sitting on. This house could fund years of top-quality care." The pieces clicked into place with the brutal clarity of a gavel hitting wood. This wasn't about her well-being. This was about real estate, about inheritance, about the inconvenience of having an elderly parent who refused to conveniently disappear into institutional care so her children could get on with dividing up her assets. "You've thought of everything," she said finally, her lawyer's training keeping her voice level even as something cracked inside her chest. "We have," Linda said, misreading her mother's tone entirely. "And the best part is, once you're settled somewhere nice, you won't have to worry about any of this anymore. We can handle the house, the finances, all of it." Marcus set his phone down entirely now, his eyes moving between his mother and grandmother with growing understanding. James stared at his hands, his discomfort written across his face in lines that seemed to deepen by the minute. "I see." Debbie closed the brochures carefully, her hands steady despite the earthquake happening inside her. "This is very thoughtful, all of it." The relief on her children's faces was almost comical. They thought she was capitulating. They thought the difficult conversation was over, that she would simply go gentle into their good night, grateful for their management of her inconvenient existence. "I think," she continued, rising from her chair with the dignity she'd learned in courtrooms, "I need some time to process all of this. It's quite a lot to take in on one's birthday." "Of course, Mom," David said, his voice warm with what he clearly believed was victory. "Take all the time you need. We're here to support you through this transition." Transition. The word hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had already consumed everything valuable. "If you'll excuse me," Debbie said, gathering the brochures into a neat stack. "I think I'd like to rest for a bit." She walked toward the stairs with measured steps, aware that 3 generations of her family were watching her go. In the reflection of the hallway mirror, she caught a glimpse of Marcus's face and saw in his expression something that looked remarkably like respect mixed with concern. At the top of the stairs, she paused to listen to the voices below. Linda was already discussing logistics with David, their voices bright, with the enthusiasm of people solving a problem that had been weighing on them. Tommy's voice was quieter, asking something about timing and whether they'd looked into the financial details. Only James seemed to have nothing to add to the conversation. Debbie closed her bedroom door behind her and stood in the center of the room she had shared with her husband for 28 years before his death 5 years ago. The law books on her shelves seemed to straighten themselves, as if responding to some shift in the atmosphere. The framed diplomas on the wall, her JD from University of Washington, her real estate license, the certificates of appreciation from pro bono work, appeared to glow with renewed purpose. She sat down at her desk, the nursing home brochures spread before her like evidence, in a case she was preparing to argue. Her laptop hummed to life, and her fingers found the keyboard with the muscle memory of someone who had once commanded conference rooms and negotiation tables. For the first time in 5 years, Deborah Taylor felt like herself again, and she had work to do. Marcus's hand trembled slightly as he knocked on his grandmother's bedroom door, the sound barely audible above the heated discussion still raging downstairs. 3 hours had passed since Debbie's retreat, and the family's initial celebration had devolved into what sounded like a strategy session for dividing spoils. "Come in, sweetheart," came Debbie's voice, steady and controlled in a way that made Marcus pause. He'd expected tears, maybe the kind of defeated silence that had become too familiar in this house over the past few years. Instead, he found his grandmother seated at her mahogany desk, surrounded by open law books and legal pads covered in her precise handwriting. Her laptop screen glowed with what appeared to be Washington state tenant law statutes, and the nursing home brochures had been arranged in a neat row like evidence in a court case. "Grandma?" Marcus stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. "Are you okay? I mean, that was pretty revealing?" Debbie supplied, looking up from her notes with eyes that held none of the hurt he'd expected. Instead, there was something sharp and calculating there, something that reminded him of the stories his grandfather used to tell about watching her cross-examine hostile witnesses. I suppose it was, at that. The transformation was startling. Gone was the slightly stooped posture of an elderly woman trying not to be a burden. In its place sat someone who looked like she could command a courtroom, her spine straight, her hands moving across legal documents with practiced efficiency. "They don't know, do they?" Marcus asked, settling into the reading chair by her window. "About what you used to do, I mean. Really do." Debbie's smile was sharp as winter moonlight. "Your mother and uncles have spent so many years seeing me as just, Mom, that they've forgotten I had a career that lasted longer than all of their marriages combined." She gestured to the diplomas on her wall, credentials that had been gathering dust like museum pieces. 30 years of real estate law, property disputes and contract negotiations. "I've handled evictions before, Marcus. Just never on my own children." The weight of that statement settled between them like a stone dropped in still water. Marcus had always known his grandmother was smart, but he'd never seen her like this. Focused, professional, dangerous, in a way that had nothing to do with physical threat and everything to do with intellectual precision. "Mom keeps saying you're getting confused," Marcus said carefully, "that you need help managing things." "Your mother," Debbie replied, pulling out a manila folder and opening it with the deliberate care of someone presenting evidence, "has contributed exactly $0 to household expenses in 3 years. Your stepfather has been unemployed for 2 years, but somehow never applies for positions that would require them to move out. And your Uncle David has been listing this address as his business headquarters for his various failed ventures without asking permission or paying rent. She slid a legal pad across the desk toward him, and Marcus saw columns of numbers, dates, and what looked like a comprehensive financial analysis. His grandmother had documented everything: utility bills, grocery expenses, property taxes, maintenance costs. In the credit column, next to the names of her 3 children, were rows of zeros. I've been subsidizing 3 separate households while being told I'm the one who can't manage, Debbie continued, her voice carrying the measured cadence of someone building a case. It's quite remarkable, really. I'm supposedly too confused to live independently, but somehow competent enough to fund everyone else's lifestyle indefinitely. Marcus studied the figures, his stomach tightening as the full scope of the situation became clear. His mother wasn't just living rent-free. She was treating his grandmother like a live-in servant, expecting meals prepared, messes cleaned, and Marcus himself to be supervised while she pursued her art projects that never seemed to generate income. "What are you going to do?" he asked, though part of him already knew. Debbie turned her laptop screen toward him, and Marcus saw a legal document template for residential eviction notices. His grandmother had been busy during her 3-hour rest, and the research was thorough. Washington state landlord-tenant law, property owner rights, required notice periods. It was all there, organized with the methodical precision of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. 30 days is the minimum required notice for month-to-month tenancies, she said, as if discussing the weather. Since none of them have lease agreements or pay rent, they're essentially squatters with my permission. Permission I am legally entitled to revoke. The door opened without a knock, and Rosa Delgado peered in, carrying a tray with coffee and what looked like homemade cookies. At 75, Rosa moved with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd spent 40 years as an ICU nurse, and her dark eyes took in the scene with immediate understanding. "Ah," she said, setting the tray on Debbie's nightstand. "Finally decided to stop playing victim, did we?" "Rosa." Marcus started, but his grandmother waved him quiet. "It's all right, sweetheart. Rosa has been trying to get me to stand up for myself for months. Haven't you, Rosa?" "Years," Rosa corrected, settling herself on the edge of the bed with the comfortable familiarity of true friendship. "Ever since that first one moved back in after his wife threw him out. I told you then, give them a month to get back on their feet, then set boundaries. But no, you were worried about being the mean mother." Marcus watched the interaction with growing fascination. He'd always known Rosa lived next door and visited frequently, but he'd never realized the depth of her friendship with his grandmother or the extent to which she'd been witnessing the family dynamics from the outside. "Your children," Rosa continued, accepting a cup of coffee from Debbie, "have been taking advantage of your guilt over Harold's death, using your grief as a weapon to keep you compliant." The mention of his grandfather's name hung in the air like incense. Marcus remembered those first months after the funeral, how his grandmother had seemed to shrink into herself, how eager she'd been when David showed up with his sob story about needing just a few weeks to get back on his feet after his latest business failure. "One by one," Debbie murmured, more to herself than to them. "First David, then Linda and James after he lost his job." Tommy was already in the garage by then, supposedly finishing his latest degree. She looked up at Marcus. "I was so lonely after your grandfather died. When they needed help, it felt like I had a purpose again." "And they knew it," Rosa said bluntly. "Emotional manipulation, clear as day. Any nurse who's worked geriatrics has seen it 100 times. Adult children who view their aging parents as inconvenient ATMs until it's time to liquidate the assets." Marcus felt a flush of shame, remembering his own complicity in the arrangement. How many times had he let his mother send him to ask his grandmother for help with school expenses or activities, knowing she'd never refuse him directly? How often had he eaten meals she'd prepared without offering to help cook or clean up afterward? "I've been part of it too," he said quietly. Debbie reached across the desk and took his hand, her grip stronger than he'd expected. "No, sweetheart. You're 16 years old. And you're not responsible for the adults in your life making selfish choices. But you're old enough to understand what's happening, and old enough to decide what kind of man you want to become. Rosa stood up, smoothing her pants with the no-nonsense gesture of someone preparing for action. So what's the plan? Because those three downstairs are getting mighty comfortable making decisions about your future. The plan, Debbie said, returning to her legal documents with renewed focus, is to remind them that this is my house, bought with my money, maintained with my resources, and that their tenancy here exists entirely at my discretion. She pulled out a fresh legal pad and began writing in the careful script Marcus remembered from birthday cards and Christmas notes. But now those same hands were crafting eviction notices, with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much legal force each word carried. 30 days for David, she murmured as she wrote. 30 days for Linda and James. Tommy. She paused, her pen hovering over the paper. Tommy is more complicated. He's genuinely struggling with addiction, not just entitlement. Same notice period, Rosa said firmly. Addiction isn't an excuse for exploitation, and enabling isn't love. You know that. Marcus watched his grandmother work, seeing her transform before his eyes from the accommodating elderly woman his family had taken for granted into something far more formidable. The nursing home brochures still sat on her desk, but now they looked less like threats and more like evidence of miscalculation. They have no idea what they've awakened, Rosa observed, reading over Debbie's shoulder as she crafted the legal notices. 30 years of real estate law, and they think you're just a confused old lady who can't manage her own affairs. The irony, Debbie said, signing her name with a flourish that spoke of decades of legal documents, is that I've been managing everyone's affairs. I just haven't been managing them in my own best interest. Marcus felt something shift inside him as he watched his grandmother reclaim her authority. For years he'd watched the adults in his family treat her like a convenient resource, assuming her compliance, taking her generosity for granted. He'd internalized their narrative that she was becoming fragile, confused, in need of their guidance and eventual management. Instead, he was seeing someone who had simply been choosing kindness over self-preservation, and who had finally realized that distinction mattered. "Grandma?" he said, his voice carrying a new respect. "What do you need me to do?" Her smile transformed her face, erasing years of accommodation and replacing them with the sharp satisfaction of someone who had found her footing again. "Help me research senior living facilities," she said, her tone light with humor that had been missing for months. "Not for me, for them." The morning rain drummed against the windows of Pierce, Hamilton and Associates. As Debbie Taylor sat in the reception area, her leather portfolio resting on her knees like armor. 27 floors above Seattle's financial district, the law firm occupied the kind of prestigious space that spoke of billable hours and corporate retainers. She'd built half her career in offices like this one, yet sitting here as a client, rather than a colleague, felt strange, like returning to a childhood home that had been redecorated by strangers. "Mrs. Taylor?" A young woman appeared at the reception desk, her professional smile warm but cautious. "I'm Sarah Kim. Thank you for coming in on such short notice." Debbie rose, extending her hand with the firm grip she'd perfected decades ago, in rooms full of men who expected elderly women to wilt under pressure. Sarah Kim was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s, with intelligent eyes and the kind of understated elegance that suggested competence without ostentation. "Ms. Kim, I appreciate you making time for me." Debbie's voice carried the measured cadence of someone who understood that first impressions in legal settings often determined outcomes. "I know elder law isn't typically handled as an emergency consultation." Sarah's office was smaller than the senior partners, suites but efficiently organized, with family photos positioned strategically to humanize the space without appearing unprofessional. Debbie noticed a picture of an elderly Asian couple, clearly Sarah's parents, their faces reflecting the kind of respectful family dynamic that had become foreign to her own experience. "Your message mentioned eviction notices for family members," Sarah said, settling behind her desk with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read between the lines of client communications. "I have to admit that's not something we typically handle in elder law. Usually we're helping seniors avoid eviction, not initiate it." Debbie opened her portfolio and extracted the nursing home brochures, placing them on Sarah's desk like evidence exhibits. "These were my 80th birthday gifts, from my 3 adult children. all of whom are currently living rent-free in my home. Sarah's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, her professional neutrality giving way to something that looked like recognition. She picked up one of the brochures, studying the cheerful marketing copy with the kind of attention lawyers reserved for contracts with buried clauses. "How long have they been living with you?" Sarah asked, her tone carefully neutral. "David, my eldest, moved back 3 years ago after his third divorce. Linda and her husband James arrived 2 years ago when he lost his teaching position. My youngest, Tommy, has been in my converted garage for 4 years, supposedly finishing various graduate degrees." Debbie's voice carried no emotion, just facts presented with courtroom precision. "Between the 3 households, they've contributed $0 to expenses while I've subsidized utilities, food, maintenance, and property taxes on a house worth approximately $1.2 million. The figure hung in the air between them like a gavel strike. Sarah had been taking notes, but her pen paused as the financial scope of the situation became clear. "And the nursing home suggestion?" Sarah prompted. "Came with detailed discussions of how difficult it must be for me to manage such a large property alone, how much better I'd be with professional care and people my own age to talk to." Debbie's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "They've already researched the facilities. Very thoughtful considering they'd be the ones making decisions about liquidating my assets to pay for it." Sarah set down her pen entirely now, her professional facade cracking slightly. "Mrs. Taylor, I need to ask, and please don't take this the wrong way, but are you experiencing any cognitive decline? Any memory issues or confusion that might give them legitimate cause for concern?" The question would have offended her a week ago. Now, Debbie recognized it for what it was: due diligence from a lawyer who'd learned to distinguish between elder abuse and genuine family concern. "Ms. Kim, I practiced real estate law for 30 years. I've handled property disputes, contract negotiations, and yes, evictions. Yesterday I researched Washington state landlord-tenant law, documented 3 years of household expenses, and drafted preliminary eviction notices for tenants who have no legal standing in my property." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes holding Sarah's with the intensity of someone making a closing argument. "Does that sound like cognitive decline to you?" Sarah's smile was the first genuine expression she'd shown since the meeting began. "No, ma'am. That sounds like someone who knows exactly what she's doing. The question is whether you'll help me do it properly." Sarah picked up the nursing home brochures again, this time with what looked like personal recognition. "My parents immigrated here from South Korea 40 years ago. They're in their 70s now, still living independently, still contributing to family decisions. The idea of warehousing them in institutional care because it's convenient for me." She shook her head. "It's not how we were raised." "Different cultures, same manipulation," Debbie observed. "Though I suspect your parents raised children who see them as people rather than inconveniences." "They did." Sarah's voice carried a warmth that spoke of genuine family respect. "Which is why this case bothers me more than it probably should. You're not asking for help because you can't manage. You're asking for help because your own children are treating you like a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be respected." The validation hit Debbie harder than she'd expected. For months, she'd been questioning her own perceptions, wondering if her children's increasing dismissiveness was justified, if she really was becoming a burden who needed management rather than respect. "Can you help me?" she asked, the question carrying more vulnerability than she'd intended. "Legally? Absolutely. You own the property, they have no lease agreements, they pay no rent, and Washington state law is very clear about property owners' rights to terminate tenancy arrangements." Sarah pulled out a legal pad and began making notes with practiced efficiency. 30 days written notice is the minimum requirement. After that, if they refuse to vacate, you can file for formal eviction through the courts. "And practically?" Sarah's expression grew more serious. "That's more complicated. Family members who've been living rent-free for years rarely go quietly. They'll likely challenge your competency, claim you're being manipulated by outside influences, maybe even try to establish some kind of implied tenancy rights. Let them try." Debbie's voice carried the confidence of someone who'd spent decades in legal combat. I have documentation of every household expense, every utility bill, every property tax payment. I have bank records showing exactly who contributes what to household maintenance. And I have 3 nursing home brochures that demonstrate their real priorities. Sarah was writing more quickly now, the legal implications clearly engaging her professional instincts. We'll need to be very careful about the process. Proper written notice, certified mail, documented delivery. If this goes to court, we want everything procedurally perfect. How long will it take? If they comply with the notices, 30 days. If they fight it. Sarah paused, calculating. Formal eviction proceedings can take 2 to 4 months, assuming they don't drag it out with competency challenges or other stall tactics. The timeline was longer than Debbie had hoped, but shorter than she'd feared. 4 months of legal battle versus potentially years of continued exploitation while her children planned her institutional future. There's something else you should consider, Sarah continued, her tone growing more personal. This will likely destroy your relationships with your children permanently. Family evictions rarely end with reconciliation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Debbie considered this, weighing the loss of relationships that had already become transactional against the possibility of reclaiming her autonomy and self-respect. Ms. Kim, she said finally, what kind of relationships am I preserving? Ones where I'm valued only for my real estate and financial contribution. Where my own children see me as an obstacle to their inheritance rather than a person deserving respect? Sarah nodded slowly, recognition dawning in her eyes. You're not just evicting tenants. You're choosing self-respect over enabling. Exactly. Debbie closed her portfolio with the decisive snap of someone who'd made up her mind. How soon can we begin? I can have the eviction notices drafted by tomorrow afternoon. Professional service, certified mail, everything properly documented. Sarah's tone shifted into full professional mode. My retainer is $5,000, which should cover the initial filings and basic proceedings. If this gets contested and goes to trial, we'll discuss additional fees. Debbie reached for her checkbook without hesitation. $5,000 was less than she'd spent subsidizing her children's lives in the past 2 months. One more question, Sarah said as Debbie wrote the check. Do you have somewhere safe to stay if things get ugly? Family who can take you in temporarily. I have Rosa, my neighbor and closest friend, but I won't be the one leaving. Debbie's smile was sharp with renewed confidence. It's my house. They're the ones who need to find somewhere else to go. As she left the law office 20 minutes later, Debbie felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The rain had stopped, and downtown Seattle spread out below her like a city she was seeing clearly for the first time in months. Her children thought they were managing a confused old woman who couldn't handle her own affairs. Instead, they'd awakened someone who'd spent 3 decades winning legal battles they couldn't even imagine. The eviction notices would be ready tomorrow. After that, her real education would begin. The certified mail receipt felt substantial in Debbie's hands as she walked back from the post office. 3 tracking numbers carefully recorded in her appointment book like coordinates for an incoming assault. Sarah Kim had been thorough. Each eviction notice bore the official letterhead of Pierce, Hamilton & Associates, and the legal language carried the weight of 30 years of precedent behind every carefully chosen word. She paused at her front gate, studying her own house with new eyes. The Victorian had been built in 1924, its gabled roof and wraparound porch speaking to an era when homes were designed to last generations. She and Harold had bought it in 1988, when Seattle's Queen Anne neighborhood still felt like a community rather than a real estate investment opportunity. Now similar houses sold for over $1 million, their original families long since priced out by technology, money, and foreign investment. Her children had no idea what they were sitting on. Or perhaps they knew exactly what they were sitting on, which made their nursing home suggestion even more calculating. The front door opened before she could reach for her keys, and David emerged with the broad smile he typically reserved for potential investors or women he was trying to impress. Behind him trailed 2 men in expensive suits, their eyes already cataloging the crown molding and hardwood floors with the practiced assessment of people who understood property value. "Mom, perfect timing," David announced, his voice carrying the forced enthusiasm that had become his default setting. "I'd like you to meet Jake Morrison and Pete Chen from Cascade Ventures. Guys, this is my mother, Debbie Taylor. Mom, Jake and Pete are interested in the food truck concept we discussed." Debbie studied the two men, noting how their attention lingered on architectural details rather than focusing on the conversation. Jake Morrison was younger, perhaps 35, with the kind of carefully maintained casualness that spoke to significant personal wealth. Pete Chen appeared older and more serious, his assessment of the house's interior more methodical and professional. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the polite chill she'd perfected for opposing counsel. "I wasn't aware David was conducting business meetings in my home." The temperature in the conversation dropped noticeably. David's smile flickered, but he pressed on with the desperate energy of someone who'd already promised more than he could deliver. "Well, you know how it is with food service ventures. Location scouting is crucial, and I thought they might like to see the kind of stable home base operation we're working from." His laugh sounded forced even to his own ears. Plus, they were curious about the neighborhood's demographic potential. "Demographic potential," Debbie repeated, her lawyer's instincts recognizing evasion when she heard it. "For food trucks." Pete Chen cleared his throat, his discomfort becoming more apparent. "Actually, Mrs. Taylor, David mentioned that you might be interested in discussing development opportunities for the property. Queen Anne has been seeing significant residential conversion projects, and a lot like this." The pieces clicked into place with crystalline clarity. This wasn't about food trucks. David had been showing her house to developers, presenting himself as someone with authority to negotiate property sales. The nursing home brochures weren't just about getting her out of the way. They were about clearing the decks for a real estate transaction he'd already set in motion. "I see." Debbie's voice remained level, but something in her tone made Jake Morrison take a step backward. "David, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" "Mom, these guys have driven all the way from Bellevue, and we were just getting to the interesting part of the conversation." David's protest trailed off as Debbie's gaze intensified. "Now," she said, the single word carrying enough authority to make both developers excuse themselves and retreat to their BMW. David followed her into the kitchen, his swagger diminishing with each step. The room felt smaller somehow, as if the walls were closing in on whatever explanation he was preparing to offer. "You've been showing my house to developers," she said without preamble. "Mom, it's not what you think. These are just preliminary conversations. Market research, really. I wanted to understand what we're working with here, what our options might be down the road." "Our options?" "Well, yes. I mean, eventually we'll need to make decisions about the property, and it makes sense to understand the market dynamics before you warehouse me in assisted living so you can liquidate my assets without interference." David's face cycled through several expressions: surprise, indignation, and finally a kind of calculated hurt that she recognized from his childhood tantrums. "Mom, that's not fair. We're trying to plan for your future, to make sure you're taken care of. The nursing home research was about finding you the best possible care, while simultaneously researching the best possible sale price for my home. It's called being responsible." His voice took on the patronizing tone he used with his teenage daughters when they questioned his decisions. "You can't live here forever, and this house is worth serious money. Money that could fund decades of quality care." Debbie opened her purse and extracted one of the certified mail receipts, placing it on the kitchen counter between them, like a chess piece claiming territory. "David, you have 30 days to vacate this property." The color drained from his face as he stared at the receipt, his mind clearly struggling to process what he was seeing. "What is this?" "Formal eviction notice. You're a month-to-month tenant at will, which means I can terminate your tenancy with 30 days written notice, which I have now provided." "You can't be serious." His voice cracked slightly, the charming facade finally beginning to crumble. "Mom, this is crazy. You're not thinking clearly. The stress of turning 80, the pressure of managing this place alone, it's affecting your judgment. My judgment led me to document every household expense for the past 3 years. Would you like to see how much you've contributed to utilities, groceries, property maintenance, or taxes?" She pulled out a manila folder from her purse, opening it to reveal the financial analysis she'd completed with Rose's help. The answer, in case you're wondering, is $0.00. David's gaze darted between the eviction notice and the financial records, his strategic mind clearly scrambling for a new approach. This is about the developers, isn't it? Mom, I was just trying to help. You don't understand how valuable this property has become. I understand that you've been making plans for my assets without my knowledge or consent. I understand that you view my continued independence as an obstacle to your financial goals. And I understand that you've been representing yourself to investors as someone with authority over property you don't own. The kitchen door swung open, and Linda entered with the dramatic flair she brought to most family interactions. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she clutched a crumpled piece of paper that Debbie recognized as her own eviction notice. Mom, please tell me this is some kind of mistake, Linda said, her voice trembling with what appeared to be genuine distress. James is beside himself. Marcus is asking questions we don't know how to answer. The mistake, Debbie replied calmly, was allowing you to treat my generosity as an entitlement instead of a gift. Generosity? Linda's voice rose to the pitch she typically reserved for artistic criticism. Mom, we've been taking care of you, cooking meals, managing household tasks, making sure you're not isolated. That's not taking advantage. That's family support. David nodded eagerly, sensing an ally. Exactly. We've been contributing in ways that don't show up on financial spreadsheets. Debbie looked at her two middle-aged children, her son who'd been conducting real estate negotiations behind her back, her daughter who'd been treating her like unpaid domestic help while claiming artistic martyrdom, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not anger exactly, but a kind of crystalline clarity about the nature of their relationships. Linda, when was the last time you cooked a meal in this house? Well, we take turns, and with my art projects taking so much time. David, when was the last time you paid for groceries, utilities, or household maintenance? Mom, you know money's been tight since the divorce, and with the girls, expenses. Marcus. Debbie called toward the living room, where she could see her grandson pretending to do homework while clearly listening to every word. Could you join us for a moment? The teenager appeared in the kitchen doorway with the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned to navigate family drama by becoming invisible. But Debbie could see the intelligence in his eyes, the way he was processing the conversation with the sharp awareness she remembered from her own legal training. Marcus, in the 3 years you've lived here, who typically prepares meals? He glanced at his mother, then at his uncle, before answering with quiet honesty. You do, Grandma. Most of the time. Who does the grocery shopping? You do. Who pays the electric bill, the water bill, the property taxes? You do. His voice was growing quieter, but more certain. Linda's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and indignation. Marcus, that's not. We contribute in other ways. I help with creative projects, cultural enrichment. You hang poorly made sculptures in my dining room without asking permission, Debbie said matter-of-factly. That's not contribution. That's decoration without consent. The silence that followed felt heavy, with years of unspoken truths finally finding voice. David was staring at the eviction notice as if it might disappear through force of will. Linda was building toward what looked like a spectacular emotional breakdown. Marcus was watching his grandmother with something that looked remarkably like respect. 30 days? Debbie repeated, her voice gentle but implacable. All of you, this is my house, bought with my money, maintained with my resources. Your tenancy here exists entirely at my discretion, and I am exercising my legal right to revoke that discretion. Where are we supposed to go? Linda asked, her voice breaking. I suspect you'll figure it out, Debbie replied. You're both intelligent adults with college educations. You managed to live independently before you moved back here. I have confidence in your ability to do so again. David straightened slightly, his salesman's instincts kicking in one final time. Mom, let's be reasonable. This kind of disruption isn't good for anyone. Maybe we can work out some kind of arrangement, some formal agreement about responsibilities and contributions. The arrangement, Debbie said, closing her purse with decisive finality, is that you find somewhere else to live. Permanently. As she walked past them toward the stairs, she heard Linda beginning to cry and David muttering something about lawyers and competency challenges. But she also heard Marcus's voice, quiet but clear. Maybe it's time we started taking care of ourselves. In her bedroom, Debbie sat down at her desk and opened her laptop. She had research to do. If her children wanted to challenge her competency, she needed to be prepared for that battle too. After all, she'd been winning legal fights longer than they'd been alive. The dining room had been transformed into something resembling a corporate boardroom, complete with Linda's legal pads covered in what appeared to be strategic notes and David's laptop displaying what looked like tenant rights websites. Tommy sat at the far end of the table, his usual spot when family meetings required his presence but not necessarily his full participation. James occupied the chair closest to the kitchen, as if positioning himself for a quick escape. Marcus had been banished upstairs with instructions to let the adults handle this. But Debbie could see his shadow in the hallway, close enough to hear, but far enough to maintain plausible deniability. "Now that we're all here," David began, his voice carrying the measured tone he used for business presentations, "I think we need to address what happened this afternoon. Mom, these eviction notices. They're clearly the result of some kind of misunderstanding." Debbie set her coffee cup down with deliberate precision, the small sound somehow commanding attention in the charged atmosphere. She'd changed into her navy blue suit, the one she'd worn to her last day at the law firm, and her hair was pulled back in the severe bun she'd favored during depositions. "There's no misunderstanding," she said, her voice carrying the calm authority she'd perfected in courtrooms. "You've received formal notice to vacate my property. The legal language is quite clear." Linda's voice cracked as she spoke, her eyes already red-rimmed from what had clearly been an afternoon of strategic crying. "Mom, this is so hurtful. After everything we've done for you, everything we've sacrificed to be here when you needed us. What exactly have you sacrificed, Linda?" The question hung in the air like a gavel waiting to fall. Linda's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to speak. "My art career, for one thing. I gave up gallery opportunities to move back home and take care of you. James gave up job prospects in other cities because we couldn't bear the thought of leaving you alone." "Your art career," Debbie repeated thoughtfully, "which has generated exactly how much income in the past 3 years?" "Art isn't about money," Linda replied with the righteous indignation of someone whose principles had never been tested by actual financial responsibility. "It's about cultural contribution, about leaving something meaningful for future generations. And James," Debbie continued, turning to her son-in-law with the relentless focus of a cross-examination, "how many job applications have you submitted outside Seattle in the past 2 years?" James's face flushed red, and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "It's complicated. The market for history teachers is—" "James," she pressed gently, "how many applications?" "None," he admitted, his shame visible in the way his shoulders collapsed inward. But Linda felt it was important to stay close. "And Marcus's school situation?" "So neither of you has actually sacrificed anything," Debbie observed. "You've simply chosen the path of least resistance while framing it as selfless family devotion." David leaned forward, his salesman's instincts engaging. "Mom, you're being unfair. We've all been contributing in different ways. I've been helping with technology issues, managing some of your online accounts, such as listing my address as your business headquarters without permission." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. David's confident expression flickered, and Debbie could see him calculating how much she actually knew. "Those were just temporary arrangements while I was getting the food truck concept off the ground. I never meant to imply any kind of permanent business relationship. The developers you brought here this afternoon seemed to think you had authority to negotiate property transactions." Tommy's head snapped up from his previously disengaged posture. "What developers?" David shot a warning glance at his younger brother. "It wasn't like that. They were just doing market research, and I thought it might be helpful to understand what we're working with here." "We?" Debbie repeated. Interesting choice of pronoun. The silence that followed felt thick, with unspoken calculations. Each of her children was clearly reassessing their position, trying to determine how much their mother actually knew and how much she was bluffing. Linda broke first, her voice rising to the pitch that typically preceded her most dramatic performances. I can't believe you're doing this to us. Your own children. We've given you years of our lives, and this is how you repay us? By throwing us out on the street like common criminals? You're not criminals, Debbie replied calmly. You're month-to-month tenants whose tenancy I'm choosing to terminate. It's a standard legal process. We're your family, Tommy said, his voice carrying a desperation that cut through his usual chemical haze. Families don't evict each other. They work things out. For the first time since the meeting began, Debbie felt her composure waver slightly. Tommy's addiction might have clouded his judgment, but his love for her had always felt genuine, even when it was overshadowed by his need for pharmaceutical escape. Tommy, when families work things out, all parties contribute to the solution. When was the last time you paid rent? Or utilities? Or even bought groceries? His face crumpled with something that looked like actual shame rather than strategic emotion. I've been meaning to get my act together. The thesis defense is coming up, and once I finish the program, I'll be able to contribute more. Which program, Tommy? Psychology, philosophy, computer science? You've been almost finished with graduate work for 6 years. This time is different, he insisted, but even he didn't sound convinced. David cleared his throat, clearly trying to regain control of the conversation. Mom, I think we're getting sidetracked by details. The real issue here is whether this kind of drastic action is necessary. We're family. We should be able to work out our differences without involving lawyers and eviction notices. The lawyers became necessary when you started bringing developers to my house without my knowledge or consent. That was a misunderstanding. And when you presented me with nursing home brochures as birthday gifts, while simultaneously researching my property's development potential. David's face went through several rapid color changes as the connections became clear to everyone in the room. Linda's strategic crying stopped abruptly as she stared at her brother with dawning comprehension. You've been planning to sell the house, she said, her voice flat with realization. Not sell, David protested weakly. Just explore options for Mom's future care needs. While she's conveniently tucked away in assisted living, unable to interfere with your real estate transactions, Debbie observed. Tommy was staring at his older brother with something approaching disgust. Jesus, David. Even for you, that's cold. Don't act like you weren't part of this, David snapped back, his composure finally cracking. You voted for the nursing home option just like everyone else. I voted for whatever would get me through the next few months without having to face reality, Tommy replied with brutal honesty. But I wasn't planning to profit from it. James had remained silent throughout the exchange, but now he spoke up with quiet conviction. We need to leave, Linda whirled on him with fury. What did you say? We need to leave, he repeated, his voice growing stronger. This is wrong, all of it. We've been treating your mother like a resource instead of a person, and I'm ashamed of my part in it. James, you can't be serious. Where are we supposed to go? Marcus is in his junior year, and my art requires a stable environment. Your art, James said with the weight of 2 years of suppressed resentment, consists of buying sculptures from other artists and claiming them as your own work. I've seen the receipts, Linda, the storage unit full of pieces you've been passing off as your creations. The accusation hit the room like a physical blow. Linda's face went white, then red, then white again, as she processed the public exposure of what had clearly been a private deception. That's not. I use them as inspiration, as starting points for my own creative process. You remove the original artist's signatures and add your own, James continued, his quiet voice somehow carrying more impact than shouting would have. I've watched you do it. Marcus appeared in the doorway, no longer pretending to be upstairs. His young face carried a mixture of disappointment and something that looked like relief at finally hearing the truth spoken aloud. Is that true, Mom? He asked quietly. Linda looked around the room at the faces staring at her. Her husband's quiet condemnation, her brother's calculating assessment, Tommy's drug-hazed disappointment, her mother's professional evaluation, and her son's dawning understanding of who she really was. Art is about interpretation, she said weakly, about building on existing forms to create new meaning. Art, Debbie said with quiet finality, is about creating something original, not stealing someone else's work and claiming credit for it. The silence that followed felt like the moment after a verdict is read. David was frantically typing on his phone, probably researching tenant rights and competency challenges. Linda was staring at her hands as her carefully constructed identity crumbled around her. Tommy was looking at his mother with something approaching respect for the first time in years. And Marcus was watching it all, with the sharp attention of someone learning crucial lessons about integrity, accountability, and the difference between love and enabling. 30 days, Debbie repeated, standing up from the table with the dignity of someone who had reclaimed her authority. All of you, this is my house, and you are no longer welcome as permanent residents. As she walked toward the stairs, she heard Linda begin to sob. Real tears this time, not strategic ones. David was already on his phone, calling what sounded like a legal aid society. Tommy was just sitting in stunned silence. But Marcus followed her to the bottom of the staircase. "Grandma," he said quietly, "I'm proud of you." For the first time in years, Debbie Taylor felt like she was exactly where she belonged, in her own house, making her own decisions, setting her own boundaries. The battle was just beginning, but she was no longer fighting it alone. The War Council convened in David's basement bedroom at 7 in the morning, the space dimly lit by a single desk lamp and the glow from his multiple monitors. Empty energy drink cans and legal document printouts covered every available surface, testament to his all-night research session. Linda sat perched on the edge of his unmade bed, her eyes puffy from crying, but her jaw set with the kind of determination that came from having nothing left to lose. Tommy slumped in the corner chair, looking more alert than usual despite, or perhaps because of, the crisis. "I've been researching all night," David announced, brandishing a thick stack of printed pages like a weapon. "Washington State has very specific protections for tenants. And Mom can't just throw us out because she's having some kind of emotional breakdown." "It's not an emotional breakdown," Tommy said quietly. "She's sharp as a tack, and we all know it." David shot him a warning glance. "The point is, she's acting irrationally. 80-year-old women don't suddenly start evicting their families without cause. There has to be something else going on." Linda seized on the opening. "Exactly. Rosa Delgado has been filling her head with ideas, turning her against us. I've seen them whispering together on the porch, plotting. Or," Tommy interjected with uncomfortable honesty, "maybe she's finally figured out that we've been taking advantage of her generosity." "Whose side are you on?" David snapped. "I'm trying to figure out what's real here." Tommy's voice carried an unusual clarity that suggested he might be having one of his increasingly rare sober moments. "We moved back in during crises, stayed longer than we said we would, and contributed nothing financially while making decisions about her future behind her back." David's face flushed with frustration. "We're family. Families help each other. We don't keep score of every dollar spent or favor exchanged." "Don't we?" Tommy pulled out his phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be banking apps. "Because I've been thinking about this, and in the past year alone, she's probably spent $20,000 keeping us all afloat. My prescription costs, Linda's art supplies, your business expenses." "Those weren't gifts," Linda protested. "Those were investments in our futures. She knows that once my art career takes off, once David's business succeeds, once you finish your degree." Once, Tommy repeated. "Always once, never now. Never actually contributing to the household that supports us." David stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward into the wall. "Fine. If you want to side with her against your own family, be my guest, but Linda and I are going to fight this. We have legal options." He pulled out a business card from the stack of papers on his desk. "I found a lawyer who specializes in elder law. He says there are grounds to challenge Mom's competency if she's making irrational financial decisions or being unduly influenced by outside parties." Linda perked up, sensing opportunity. Rosa Delgado definitely qualifies as undue influence. She's been poisoning Mom against us for months. Or, Tommy said again, his voice gaining strength, Rosa's been the only person telling Mom the truth about how we've been treating her. The basement fell silent except for the hum of David's computers. Linda stared at her youngest brother as if he'd suddenly sprouted a second head. Tommy, what's gotten into you? He was quiet for a long moment, his hands trembling slightly in a way that suggested he was fighting more than just family dynamics. I've been thinking about what she said upstairs. About families working things out requiring all parties to contribute to the solution. And? When was the last time any of us actually solved one of her problems instead of creating them? His voice cracked slightly. When Dad died, she was devastated, completely lost. And what did we do? We moved in and made ourselves her new problems to manage. David's patience snapped. She invited us. She wanted the company. She wanted family, Tommy corrected. She got tenants who don't pay rent and treat her like hired help. Linda's strategic tears made their reappearance. I can't believe you're talking about us this way. After everything we've been through together, all the support we've given each other. What support? The question came out harsher than Tommy had intended. Linda, you use Mom as free childcare for Marcus while you play with Clay. David, you use her address for your business ventures and bring developers to her house without permission. And I... He paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I use her medicine cabinet like my personal pharmacy. The admission hung in the stale basement air like a confession. Linda's tears stopped abruptly, and David's anger shifted into something more like calculation. If you're admitting to drug abuse, David said carefully, that could actually support our competency argument. Mom's been enabling addictive behavior, making irrational decisions about who to support financially. Stop. Tommy's voice carried a finality that surprised everyone, including himself. Just stop. She's not the one with the problem here. We are. He stood up from the chair, swaying slightly but maintaining his balance. I'm going to talk to her, apologize. Try to figure out if there's any way to make this right. Tommy, don't be an idiot. David called after him as he headed for the basement stairs. If we stick together on this, we can fight the eviction. But if you break ranks... Tommy paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking back at his siblings with something that might have been pity. David, she's not the enemy here. She's our mother, and we've been treating her like a resource to be managed, instead of a person to be respected. Respected? Linda's voice rose to the pitch that typically preceded one of her dramatic episodes. We've been taking care of her for years. Cooking, cleaning, making sure she's not alone. When was the last time you cooked a meal in this house, Linda? The question came from the stairway, where Marcus had appeared with the silent movement of someone who'd learned to navigate family drama by becoming invisible. But his voice carried a new authority that made all three adults turn toward him. Marcus, Linda began, this is an adult conversation. I'm almost 17, he interrupted, his voice steady despite the obvious tension. I've been watching this family for 2 years, and Tommy's right. We've all been using Grandma instead of appreciating her. David tried to regain control of the narrative. Marcus, your grandmother is going through a difficult time. She's making decisions that will hurt the whole family, and we need to stick together to help her through this. Help her? Marcus's voice carried a skepticism that sounded far older than his years. Uncle David, you brought real estate developers to her house. Mom, you've been taking credit for art you didn't create. Uncle Tommy, you've been stealing her prescription medication. The silence that followed felt like the moment after a bomb detonates. Linda's face went white, David's jaw tightened with barely controlled fury, and Tommy looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. I see everything that happens in this house, Marcus continued, his young voice carrying the weight of uncomfortable truths. Grandma cooks, cleans, pays bills, and manages everyone else's problems. You all make messes and expect her to clean them up. She's not the one who needs help here. Linda found her voice first, though it came out as more of a croak. Marcus, You don't understand the complexities of adult relationships, the sacrifices we've made. I understand that Grandma has been subsidizing 3 separate households while being told she's the one who can't manage her own affairs. His gaze moved between the 3 adults with the unflinching directness of youth. I understand that you've been making plans for her future without including her in the decision-making process. David's tactical mind kicked in, recognizing that Marcus represented either a valuable ally or a dangerous witness. Marcus, family loyalty means supporting each other through difficult times. Your grandmother is making a mistake that could hurt all of us. Family loyalty, Marcus repeated thoughtfully, would be respecting her enough to contribute fairly to the household instead of treating her like an ATM with cooking skills. Tommy was staring at his nephew with something approaching awe. When did you get so smart? Someone in this family had to start paying attention to reality instead of living in self-serving fantasies. The assessment was brutal in its simplicity, and none of the adults seemed to have a response. Linda tried tears again, but they looked forced and manipulative even to her own family. David's anger was building toward explosion, his face reddening with the frustration of someone whose usual tactics were failing. Tommy just looked defeated, as if Marcus's words had stripped away the last of his comfortable self-deceptions. Fine, David said finally, his voice tight with controlled fury. If that's how everyone feels, Linda and I will handle this ourselves. We'll find a lawyer, challenge the eviction, and protect this family's interests with or without your support. Good luck with that, Marcus said quietly. But just so you know, Grandma asked me to help her research elder law attorneys yesterday. She's already 3 steps ahead of whatever you're planning. He turned to leave, then paused at the bottom of the stairs. Uncle Tommy, she's in the kitchen if you want to talk to her. She's making breakfast for anyone who wants to contribute to an actual conversation instead of a battle plan. As Marcus disappeared up the stairs, the 3 adults were left staring at each other in the dim basement light, the wreckage of their family's dysfunction finally visible to everyone involved. The war they'd planned to fight had already begun, but the battle lines were nothing like what they'd expected. Tommy found Debbie in the kitchen, standing at the stove with the kind of focused attention she brought to tasks that required precision. The morning light streaming through the window caught the silver in her hair, but her posture was straight, her movements economical and purposeful. She was making what appeared to be enough scrambled eggs for the entire household, a habit so ingrained it continued even in the midst of family warfare. Mom? His voice cracked slightly, the word carrying more vulnerability than he'd intended. She turned toward him, and he was struck by how clear her eyes looked, not the slightly glazed expression of someone struggling with age-related confusion, but the sharp focus of someone who had made difficult decisions and was prepared to defend them. Good morning, Tommy. Would you like some coffee? The simple domesticity of the offer, made without judgment or recrimination despite everything that had transpired, nearly undid him. He nodded and slumped into one of the kitchen chairs, watching her pour coffee with the steady hands of someone who had mastered the small rituals that held life together. I've been using your prescription medication, he said abruptly, the confession tumbling out before he could lose his nerve. Not just occasionally, regularly. For months. Debbie set the coffee mug in front of him and returned to the stove, her silence neither condemning nor absolving. She was listening, he realized, actually listening rather than preparing her response or calculating how to manage his revelation. I know, she said finally. I've known for over a year. The admission hit him like a physical blow. You knew? I've been counting pills, Tommy. I'm not naive about addiction, and I'm not blind to the signs. She turned to face him, her expression gentle but unflinching. The question is what you plan to do about it. He stared into his coffee, watching steam rise like the remnants of illusions being burned away. I don't know. I've been telling myself I'd get clean. Once I finished school, once I found steady work, once things settled down, but there's always another excuse, another reason to delay. And now? Now I'm sitting in my mother's kitchen, having stolen her medication while she subsidized my life, and she's the one being called incompetent. His laugh was bitter and self-aware. The irony is pretty devastating. Debbie moved the eggs off the burner and sat down across from him, her hands wrapped around her own coffee mug. Tommy, what do you want? Not what you think you should want. Not what would make other people happy. What do you actually want for your life? The question caught him off guard. When was the last time anyone had asked him what he wanted, rather than what he planned to do, or when he planned to do it? I want to stop lying to myself, he said slowly. I want to stop using your generosity as a shield against my own problems. I want to figure out who I am when I'm not high or planning to get high. Those are good starting points. Are they enough to change your mind about the eviction? Debbie's pause stretched long enough to encompass years of enabling, months of growing frustration, and the recent devastation of discovering how little her children valued her autonomy. No, she said gently, but they might be enough to change how we handle the transition. Before Tommy could respond, the kitchen door swung open and Marcus entered, followed by James, who looked like he hadn't slept. Both men carried the careful neutrality of people entering a potential war zone. Is it safe to get coffee? Marcus asked, his attempt at lightness not quite masking his genuine concern. It's always safe to get coffee, Debbie replied, gesturing toward the counter. Though I should mention that your mother and Uncle David are in the basement planning some kind of legal challenge to my competency. James winced visibly. I'm not part of that, Debbie. I want you to know that. What are you part of, James? The question was delivered without hostility, but James flinched as if he'd been struck. He poured coffee with shaking hands before answering. For 2 years I've been part of a lie, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've let Linda turn our marriage into a performance where I play the supportive husband of a struggling artist while she commits fraud and we both live off your generosity. Marcus set down his coffee mug with enough force to make everyone look at him. What kind of fraud? James looked at Debbie as if asking permission to continue. She nodded slightly. Your mother has been buying sculptures from other artists, emerging artists who need money, and removing their signatures. She adds her own name and presents them as original work. The pieces in the dining room, the ones she's supposedly been creating in her studio, none of them are actually hers. The revelation hung in the kitchen air like smoke from a fire. Marcus stared at his stepfather with the expression of someone having a fundamental assumption about reality challenged. For how long? Since before we moved back here. Maybe longer. James's voice carried the weight of 2 years of complicity. I told myself it wasn't really hurting anyone, that she was just trying to build confidence, that eventually she'd start creating original work. But she never did, Debbie observed. She never did. And the longer it went on, the more elaborate the deception became. Gallery submissions under false pretenses, artist statements describing her, creative process, that never happened. Even applications for grants based on work she didn't create. Tommy was staring at James with something approaching respect. Jesus, at least when I steal pills, I'm only lying to myself. It gets worse, James continued, his confession gaining momentum like a confession that had been bottled up too long. When we moved back here, Linda started presenting herself as your caregiver to justify not looking for paying work. She joined support groups for adult children caring for aging parents, applied for caregiver assistance programs, while treating me like unpaid household staff. Debbie finished. While treating you like unpaid household staff, James confirmed. Marcus had gone very quiet, processing the scope of his mother's deception. The college application essays, he said suddenly, the ones about how Mom sacrificed her art career to care for her aging mother. I wrote about how proud I was of her selflessness. The pain in his young voice was sharp enough to cut. Debbie reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Marcus, you wrote about what you believed to be true. That's not your fault. But it's not true, is it? None of it is true. No, sweetheart, none of it is true. The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the wall clock and the distant rumble of what sounded like David's voice carrying up from the basement. Probably on a phone call with his lawyer. I want to move out, James said abruptly. With or without Linda. I can't continue being part of this. Where will you go? Debbie asked. I've been researching teaching positions in other states. There are openings in districts that aren't as impacted by budget cuts. I should have done it 2 years ago. He looked at Marcus with genuine regret. I should have insisted we maintain our independence instead of taking the easy path. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with divided loyalties and harsh realities. What about Mom? Your mother, James said carefully. We'll have to decide whether she wants to acknowledge the truth about her behavior or continue living in self-serving fantasies. I can't make that choice for her. And I can't enable it anymore, Debbie added. For any of you. Tommy lifted his head from his hands, his eyes clearer than they'd been in months. What if I checked myself into rehab? A real program, not just outpatient counseling. Would that buy me time to figure out a plan that doesn't involve living here indefinitely? Tommy, rehab isn't a negotiating tactic. It's a life-changing commitment. I know, that's why I'm asking. His voice carried a sincerity that had been absent for years. I'm tired of being high more than I'm sober. I'm tired of stealing from you and lying about it. I'm tired of being 38 years old and living like a teenager in my mother's garage. Debbie studied her youngest son's face, looking for the manipulation tactics that had become his default mode, but finding instead something that looked remarkably like genuine desire for change. There's a program in Portland, she said slowly. 90 days inpatient followed by supervised transitional housing. I researched it last year when your addiction became impossible to ignore. You researched rehab programs? I researched a lot of things while you all assumed I was becoming confused and incompetent. The front door opened with enough force to rattle the windows, and Rosa Delgado's voice carried through the house with the authority of someone who had no patience for tiptoeing around family drama. Debbie Taylor, where are you? We have visitors. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, her expression grim but purposeful. Behind her stood 2 women in professional attire. One appeared to be in her 40s with the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to authority, the other younger, carrying what looked like official documentation. This is Detective Maria Santos from Seattle PD's Elder Fraud Unit, Rosa announced without preamble. And this is Janet Morrison from Adult Protective Services. They've received some interesting phone calls about this household. The temperature in the kitchen seemed to drop 10 degrees. James went pale. Tommy straightened in his chair with sudden alertness, and Marcus looked between the officials and his grandmother with growing understanding. What kind of phone calls? Debbie asked, her lawyer's training kicking in automatically. Detective Santos stepped forward, her voice professional but not unsympathetic. We've received reports suggesting that you may be experiencing elder abuse, specifically financial exploitation and potential competency issues. We're required to investigate. Who made the reports? I'm not at liberty to discuss specifics, but I can tell you that multiple calls were made within the past hour, expressing concern about your recent decision-making and suggesting that you may be being unduly influenced by outside parties. Rosa's expression turned thunderous. Let me guess. The outside parties would be me, and the concerned family members would be the ones who've been living rent-free while making plans to liquidate your assets. Detective Santos's eyebrows rose slightly. Mrs. Delgado, I understand you're a neighbor? I'm a retired ICU nurse who's been watching this family exploit Debbie's generosity for 3 years while treating her like hired help. If someone wants to discuss elder abuse, I have documentation. The basement door burst open, and David appeared with Linda close behind, both of them stopping short when they saw the official visitors. David's face went through several rapid calculations before settling on his most charming smile. Officers, thank goodness you're here, he said, his voice carrying practiced concern. We've been so worried about Mom. She's been making very unusual decisions lately, and we're concerned about her judgment. Detective Santos studied David with the flat gaze of someone who had learned to recognize performance from genuine concern. Mr. Taylor, I presume? David Taylor, yes, Debbie's eldest son. He gestured toward Linda. This is my sister Linda. We're the ones who called because we're genuinely concerned about our mother's well-being. Among other things, Rosa muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Marcus stood up from his chair, his young voice cutting through the adult maneuvering with startling clarity. Detective Santos, My grandmother is the most competent person in this house. If you want to investigate abuse, you should look at who's been taking advantage of whom." The statement hung in the charged air like a declaration of war, and Debbie realized that the battle she'd started with eviction notices had just escalated into something far more complex and dangerous. But for the first time in years, she wasn't fighting it alone. Detective Santos pulled out a small notebook, her movements deliberate and professional. "I'm going to need to speak with each of you individually, starting with Mrs. Taylor. This is a standard procedure for elder abuse investigations." "That won't be necessary," David interjected, his salesman's confidence faltering slightly under the detective's steady gaze. "We can clear this up right now. Our mother has been making impulsive decisions, evicting her own children, consulting lawyers without discussing it with family, and we're concerned about her mental state." "Mr. Taylor," Detective Santos's voice carried the patient authority of someone accustomed to managing family dynamics during investigations. "Elder abuse cases require thorough documentation. I'll be conducting individual interviews regardless of anyone's preferences." Linda stepped forward, her face streaked with what appeared to be genuine tears. "Detective, you have to understand, we love our mother. Everything we've done has been out of concern for her well-being. Living alone in this big house, managing finances, dealing with property maintenance, it's becoming too much for her. Yet, according to the preliminary information we've received, Janet Morrison from APS spoke for the first time, her voice crisp and professional. Mrs. Taylor has been managing not only her own expenses, but subsidizing multiple adult children's living situations without compensation." The statement hit the room like a physical blow. David's confident posture wavered, and Linda's tears stopped abruptly as the reality of outside scrutiny became clear. "We contribute in other ways," Linda began, but Janet Morrison held up a hand. "Mrs. Morrison, during individual interviews, we'll document all forms of contribution to the household. For now, I need to establish basic facts." She turned to Debbie. "Mrs. Taylor, do you feel safe in your home?" "I do now," Debbie replied, her voice steady. "I felt less safe when my children were making decisions about my future without my input or consent." Rosa stepped forward, her nurse's training evident in how she presented information. "Detective Santos, I have photographs documenting the condition of this house over the past 3 years, utility bills showing payment patterns, and grocery receipts. If you're investigating financial exploitation, the evidence is extensive." David's face flushed red. "Rosa, you have no right to be documenting our family's private business." "I have every right to document potential elder abuse when I witness it," Rosa replied calmly. 40 years in geriatric nursing teaches you to recognize the signs." Tommy had remained silent during the exchange, but now he spoke with surprising clarity. "Detective, I've been stealing my mother's prescription medication for over a year. She's known about it, but continued to provide me with housing and financial support. If you want to discuss who's been taking advantage of whom, I'm probably your best witness." The honesty of his confession created a moment of stunned silence. Even Janet Morrison paused in her note-taking to study Tommy's face. "Mr. Taylor, are you currently under the influence of any substances?" "Probably. I usually am. But I'm also telling the truth for the first time in years." James had been standing near the kitchen counter, but now he moved closer to the group. "Detective Santos, I've been complicit in financial fraud. My wife has been submitting other artists' work under her own name to galleries and grant organizations. We've been living here rent-free while she claimed to be providing elder care that consisted mainly of treating Debbie as unpaid domestic help." Linda whirled on her husband with fury. "James, what are you doing?" "I'm telling the truth," he replied, his voice gaining strength with each word. "I'm tired of being part of a family that exploits the one person who's been keeping us all afloat." Marcus had been watching the adult drama unfold, with the sharp attention of someone learning crucial lessons about integrity under pressure. Now he addressed the detective directly. "My grandmother asked me to help her research nursing homes yesterday. Not because she wanted to go to one, but because she wanted to understand what my family was planning for her. She's been 3 steps ahead of all of us this entire time. Detective Santos was writing steadily, her expression neutral but focused. Mrs. Taylor, can you walk me through the sequence of events that led to today's situation? Debbie straightened in her chair, her courtroom experience evident in how she organized her response. My 80th birthday was 3 days ago. My children presented me with nursing home brochures as gifts, explaining that I was no longer capable of managing this property independently. Yesterday I discovered that my eldest son had been bringing real estate developers to my house without my knowledge, representing himself as having authority to negotiate property sales. That's not what happened, David protested desperately. Those were just preliminary conversations. Mr. Taylor, Detective Santos interrupted. You'll have your opportunity to provide your version of events. Please allow your mother to continue. I consulted with my former law firm and had formal eviction notices prepared for all 3 of my adult children. 30 days notice, properly served, completely legal. Debbie's voice carried the measured cadence of someone presenting evidence. This morning, I discovered that someone from this household called both police and adult protective services, claiming I was incompetent and being unduly influenced. Janet Morrison looked up from her notes. Mrs. Taylor, what was your profession before retirement? Real estate attorney. 30 years of practice, specializing in property law and contract disputes. The APS worker and detective exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their assessment of the situation. David seemed to realize that his strategy was backfiring spectacularly. Mom, you're making this sound more calculated than it was. We were just concerned. David. Debbie's voice cut through his protest with surgical precision. You brought developers to my house and discussed development potential while simultaneously researching nursing homes for me. You've been using my address as your business headquarters without permission. These aren't actions of concern. They're actions of someone planning to liquidate assets they don't own. Tommy was staring at his older brother with dawning horror. Jesus, David, you weren't just planning to warehouse her, you were planning to cash her out. It wasn't like that. David's voice cracked with desperation. The property has development potential, and I thought if we understood the market value. You thought you'd eliminate the inconvenience of her continued independence so you could access her assets. Detective Santos observed, her tone flat with professional assessment. Linda tried one final desperate gambit. Detective, our mother is clearly being influenced by Rosa Delgado. This woman has been filling her head with suspicions about her own family, turning her against us. Mrs. Morrison, Rosa interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades advocating for vulnerable patients. I've been urging Debbie to stand up for herself for 3 years. The only influence I've provided is encouraging her to value her own well-being over her children's convenience. Janet Morrison closed her notebook and looked around the kitchen at the assembled family. Based on my preliminary assessment, Mrs. Taylor appears mentally competent, financially stable, and capable of making informed decisions about her living situation. The concerns about her judgment appear to be related to decisions that don't benefit other family members rather than decisions that harm her own interests. Detective Santos nodded in agreement. At this point, I'm seeing potential financial exploitation of an elderly person, not elder abuse by outside parties. We'll be conducting a full investigation, including financial records review and individual interviews. David's face went white as the implications became clear. Linda sank into a kitchen chair, her strategic tears giving way to what looked like genuine panic. Tommy just nodded, as if he'd been expecting this outcome. But Marcus stepped forward with the quiet courage of someone who had learned to value truth over family loyalty. Detective Santos, if you need character witnesses, I'd like to state for the record that my grandmother is the most competent, financially responsible, and emotionally stable person in this house. If anyone's been taking advantage of anyone, it's not her being exploited. The kitchen fell silent, except for the tick of the wall clock and the sound of David's labored breathing as the full scope of his miscalculation became apparent. Debbie looked around at her family, at Tommy accepting responsibility for his addiction, at James finding the courage to tell the truth, at Marcus choosing integrity over convenience, at David and Linda facing consequences for their manipulation. For the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged, in her own house, making her own decisions, with the support of people who valued her as a person rather than a resource. The investigation would continue, but the battle for her autonomy was essentially over. She had won. The morning sun streamed through Debbie's kitchen window as she signed the last of the paperwork spread across her dining table. 30 days had passed since the eviction notices were served, and the house felt different. Not empty, but purposeful in a way it hadn't been in years. The silence was no longer the oppressive quiet of unspoken resentments, but the peaceful stillness of a space reclaimed. Rosa sat across from her, reviewing a checklist with the methodical precision of someone who had spent decades managing complex care situations. Tommy's intake at the Portland facility is scheduled for tomorrow at noon. Are you sure about driving him yourself? I'm sure. Debbie's voice carried a quiet conviction that had replaced the uncertainty of previous weeks. He's the only one who actually apologized and meant it. The least I can do is see him safely to treatment. Marcus emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee, his movements more relaxed than they'd been since the investigation began. At 16, he'd grown up considerably in the past month, his easy smile returning as the household tension evaporated. "Grandma, I printed out your speaking notes for the Elder Rights Conference next week," he said, setting a coffee cup beside her papers. "I also found 3 more organizations that want to hear from you about family financial exploitation." The transformation had surprised everyone, including Debbie herself. What had started as a desperate attempt to reclaim her independence had evolved into something resembling a second career. Elder advocacy groups across the Pacific Northwest were discovering that an 80-year-old retired lawyer who had successfully fought off her own children's manipulation attempts was exactly the kind of spokesperson they needed. "Mrs. Taylor?" Sarah Kim appeared in the doorway, her professional demeanor softened by what had become a genuine friendship over the past month. "I have the final documentation from the investigation. Detective Santos wanted me to review it with you before the case is officially closed." They settled around the dining table that had once hosted the disastrous birthday celebration, the same space now serving as headquarters for Debbie's reclaimed life. Sarah opened a manila folder and extracted several documents. The financial exploitation charges against David were dropped in exchange for his cooperation in paying restitution. She began. "He's moved in with a friend in Tacoma and found steady work as a rideshare driver. No more get-rich-quick schemes, at least for now." And the real estate developers? Completely legitimate, unfortunately for David's credibility. They were genuinely interested in food truck placement strategies, not property development. His attempt to pivot their interest toward your house apparently left them more confused than convinced. Debbie almost felt sorry for her eldest son. Almost. What about Linda and James? Linda's art fraud case is still pending, but she's working with prosecutors. Apparently, she'd been defrauding emerging artists for years, not just since moving back here. James filed for divorce and took a teaching position in Oregon. He's been completely cooperative with both investigations. Marcus looked up from his college application essays. "He stopped by yesterday while you were at the doctor. Wanted to apologize again and to ask if it was okay for him to write you a character reference for my college applications." "What did you tell him?" "That he should ask you himself instead of asking me to ask you." Marcus's smile carried a new maturity. "Crazy concept, I know. Adults communicating directly with adults." Sarah continued reviewing the documentation. "The Adult Protective Services investigation concluded that you were never at risk, and were, in fact, being financially exploited by family members." Rosa's documentation was particularly helpful in establishing the timeline of the abuse. Rosa waved dismissively. 40 years of nursing teaches you to keep detailed records. Besides, someone needed to witness what was happening in case situations like this arose. The front door opened and Tommy entered carrying a small duffel bag. His appearance was startling, not just because he looked sober and alert, but because he carried himself with the careful dignity of someone who had made peace with difficult decisions. The past month of preparation for rehab had been transformative, though Debbie knew the real work lay ahead. "Ready for tomorrow?" she asked gently. Ready as someone can be for 90 days of forced sobriety and psychological evaluation. His smile was rueful, but genuine. Thank you for driving me. I know you don't owe me anything after what I put you through. Tommy, you're the only one of my children who took responsibility for your behavior and made concrete plans to change it. That earns my support. He sat down at the table, his hands remarkably steady for someone facing the prospect of medically supervised withdrawal. I've been thinking about what happens after Portland. The transitional housing program requires steady employment, and I need to figure out what I'm actually qualified to do besides collect degrees and manipulate family members. What interests you? Sarah asked. When you're not managing addiction, what actually engages your mind? Tommy considered the question with the kind of careful attention that suggested he'd been thinking about it seriously. Psychology, honestly. Understanding how people rationalize destructive behavior. How families enable each other's worst impulses. I've had a front row seat to dysfunction for years. Addiction counseling? Marcus suggested. Maybe. Or family therapy. God knows I understand how good people can create toxic dynamics without meaning to. Debbie watched her youngest son with cautious hope. The insight was promising, but she'd learned to distinguish between intellectual understanding and sustained behavioral change. Still, his willingness to enter long-term treatment suggested a seriousness about recovery that his previous attempts had lacked. There's something else, Tommy continued, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small key and placed it on the table. I cleaned out the garage completely, threw away the drug paraphernalia, organized the tools and yard equipment, swept and mopped everything. I know it doesn't make up for 3 years of using your space as my personal pharmacy, but I wanted to leave it better than I found it. The gesture was small but meaningful. Rosa picked up the key and examined it as if it were evidence of genuine transformation. What about your books and papers? Your thesis materials? Donated the books to the library, shredded the thesis materials. Tommy's voice carried no regret. I was never actually going to finish any of those degrees. They were just elaborate procrastination strategies. Ways to avoid taking real responsibility for my life. The honesty was brutal and refreshing. Marcus looked up from his applications with something approaching respect. That must have been hard to admit. Easier than continuing to lie to myself. And definitely easier than watching Mom subsidize my self-deception while I stole her medication and told myself I was the victim. Sarah closed the investigation folder and looked around the table. Mrs. Taylor, you should know that this case has become something of a reference point in elder law circles. The documentation of financial exploitation combined with your successful legal response has created precedent that other attorneys are using. Meaning, elderly people facing similar family manipulation now have a roadmap for protecting themselves. Your eviction notices were so thoroughly prepared and legally sound that they're being used as templates. Debbie felt a strange mixture of pride and sadness. Pride that her legal expertise had been useful, sadness that such templates were necessary. How common is this situation? More common than most people realize. Adult children viewing elderly parents as inconvenient obstacles to inheritance, gradual takeover of financial decision-making, isolation from outside support systems. Your case hit every major warning sign that elder advocates watch for. Rosa stood up and began gathering coffee cups with the efficient movements of someone preparing for action, which is why the speaking engagements are so important. Most elderly people don't have 30 years of legal experience to draw on when their families start planning their institutional futures. The phone rang, interrupting the conversation. Marcus answered with the casual authority of someone who had become the household's unofficial communications coordinator. Grandma, it's the Seattle Times. They want to schedule the interview about your case for next Wednesday. Debbie sighed. The media attention had been unexpected and not entirely welcome. But Sarah had convinced her that public discussion of elder exploitation served a broader purpose. Tell them Thursday morning would be better. Already did. Also, the AARP representative called to confirm your keynote speech for their regional conference next month. The transformation from isolated elderly woman to public advocate had happened so quickly that Debbie sometimes felt like she was watching someone else's life unfold. 6 weeks ago, she'd been enabling her children's dependency, while being told she was too confused to manage her own affairs. Now she was scheduling speaking engagements and consulting with other attorneys on similar cases. "How do you feel about all of this?" Sarah asked, gesturing toward the speaking notes and conference materials scattered across the table. Debbie considered the question carefully. "Like I'm finally using my skills for something that matters. For 30 years, I helped wealthy people buy and sell property. Now I'm helping vulnerable people protect themselves from family exploitation. It feels like a better use of my remaining time." "Remaining time?" Marcus looked up with concern. "Grandma, you're 80, not dying." "No, but I'm also not pretending I have unlimited years ahead of me. Which is why I want to make the ones I have count for something beyond subsidizing other people's irresponsibility." Tommy stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the garden that Debbie had been reclaiming over the past month. The roses were blooming again after years of neglect, and the vegetable patch showed signs of careful tending. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you think I can actually get clean? Permanently, I mean. Not just for a few months before relapsing again." The question carried such vulnerability that the entire room fell silent. Debbie studied her son's profile against the window, seeing traces of the brilliant, idealistic young man he'd been before addiction clouded his potential. "I think you can get clean if you want to badly enough, and if you're willing to do the work, even when it's uncomfortable," she said carefully. "But I also think you need to want it for yourself, not for me or anyone else. I do want it. I'm tired of being high more than I'm sober. I'm tired of lying and stealing and manipulating. I'm tired of being 38 years old and living like a teenager." "Then you have a chance." "Just a chance?" "Tommy, addiction is a chronic condition that requires lifetime management. I can support your recovery, but I can't guarantee it." "Nobody can." He nodded, accepting the honesty without resentment. "Fair enough. Will you visit me during the program?" "If visitors are allowed and if you want me to." "I want you to." Sarah gathered her papers and stood to leave. "Mrs. Taylor, I'll have the final documentation ready for your records by Friday. And congratulations. You've successfully reclaimed your independence and created a template for other people facing similar situations." After Sarah left, the three generations sat around the dining table in comfortable silence. The house felt different now. Not just because three freeloading adults had moved out, but because the relationships among those who remained had been fundamentally altered by truth-telling and boundary setting. "Grandma," Marcus said eventually, "I've been thinking about my college essays. The ones about family sacrifice and caregiving. I need to rewrite them." "What will you write about instead?" "About learning the difference between love and enabling. About watching someone I respect choose self-respect over people-pleasing. About discovering that the most loving thing you can sometimes do is refuse to rescue people from the consequences of their choices." Debbie smiled, recognizing her own hard-learned wisdom reflected in her grandson's insight. "That sounds like an essay that will actually help admissions committees understand who you are." "Yeah. And maybe it will help me understand who I want to become." Tommy returned from the window and sat back down, his duffel bag at his feet like an anchor to his decision. "Mom, after I get out of treatment, after I figure out steady work and stable housing, would it be okay if I visited sometimes? Not to move back in, just to visit like a normal adult child visiting his mother." "That would be wonderful, Tommy. As long as you understand that visiting means contributing to the relationship, not just showing up when you need something." "I understand." Rosa stood up and began organizing the paperwork scattered across the table. "Well, this has been the most successful family intervention I've witnessed in 40 years of nursing. Most families never get to the truth-telling part, let alone the accountability part. Most families, Debbie observed, don't have a member willing to risk everything to force the conversation. Most elderly people don't have 30 years of legal training to draw on when their children start planning their disposal." Rosa corrected, "You had advantages most people in your situation don't have. Which is why the advocacy work matters." Marcus closed his laptop and looked around the table. "So what happens now? I mean, after Uncle Tommy goes to treatment and the investigations are closed and the media interviews are finished. What does normal life look like? Debbie considered the question, realizing she hadn't thought much about ordinary life beyond the crisis management of the past month. I suppose it looks like whatever we want it to look like. A house with appropriate boundaries, relationships based on mutual respect instead of financial dependency, family interactions that don't require crisis intervention or legal documentation. Sounds boring, Marcus said with a grin. Sounds peaceful, Tommy corrected. Sounds overdue, Rosa added. As afternoon light filled the dining room, Debbie looked around at the people seated at her table. Her recovering son preparing for the hardest work of his life. Her perceptive grandson learning crucial lessons about integrity and boundaries. Her loyal friend who had refused to let her continue enabling destructive behavior. For the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. In her own house, surrounded by people who valued her as a person rather than a resource. Making decisions based on her own judgment rather than other people's convenience. The nursing home brochures were long gone, thrown away with the other detritus of her children's manipulation. In their place sat speaking notes for conferences, where she would help other elderly people recognize and respond to similar exploitation. Her last stand had become a new beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next. 6 months later, Debbie stood in her garden, pruning roses that had flourished under her renewed attention. The morning air carried the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of Marcus practicing piano, a skill he'd rediscovered in the peaceful house. At 81, she moved with the confident purpose of someone who had reclaimed not just her property, but her sense of self. The doorbell rang, and she found Tommy on her porch, carrying flowers and wearing the careful smile of someone still learning to navigate sobriety. 4 months out of treatment, he looked healthier than he had in years. Happy birthday, Mom. Thank you for remembering. She accepted the flowers, noting his steady hands and clear eyes. How are you feeling? One day at a time, like they say. But good days are outnumbering bad ones now. They settled on the porch swing, the same spot where she'd once sat feeling invisible and discarded. Now it felt like a throne overlooking her reclaimed kingdom. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,